Okay. Hi, Calvin.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to talk to you today to get your really unique experience and insights into this space of family court and what happens when families experience domestic abuse, domestic violence, and it goes really bad and it gets into the legal space. And yeah, you did a really generous piece of training for me and some other people a couple of years ago. That's when I first met you. And I was just looking through my notes, and it's really incredible, all the stuff in there. So rich. And it just reminded me what a complicated and fraught space this is. And it's new and confusing and politicized and messy. So yeah, maybe a good place to start is, can you give us a bit about your background and
Sure.
how you got into this space, and like why you're a preeminent expert risk assessor in this space?
Yeah, I think it's also worth acknowledging that the sort of things you're talking about there, and we will be talking about, also go on in, I was going to say, dark corners. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that there's anything sort of sinister about that. It's just that, as you know, that the family courts are largely a closed affair. So they're not open to public scrutiny. You have to get particular dispensation from the judge if you want to be able to report on anything related to the proceedings. Reports put into the proceedings are bound by particularly tight court rules. So unlike other spheres of activity, I think it inhibits really analysis and scrutiny, and so people come away from it with often very, very different experiences, and I think find it hard to relate those to other people because you get subjective accounts getting onto the internet, but there's no there's no sort of overarching professional narrative about the state of play. So it does feel, when you enter the family court arena, or at least the courtroom, it does feel you're going through a portal that doesn't have a lot of parallels, really. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's other sphere.
It does feel like a portal in my experience.
So in criminal proceedings, you're virtually completely exposed, to those in the courtroom, the public gallery, the media, in general, for good or bad. And then in almost any other context in life as well, there's almost always anyway, unless we're dealing with something relating to the national security. There's almost always some mechanism in place to hold those involved, professionals involved, accountable. So the corollary of that, of course, is it means there's also very little feedback loop. So I've been doing risk assessment reports now for whatever it is, 25, 30 years. And, I like to think that my reports are reasonably well received on the whole.
And these are into the risk of an individual committing domestic violence.
So almost all of my work, these days, all of my work is about putting together assessments in the context in which an individual or a couple, either together or separated, are referred to me for an assessment to determine what is the risk of ongoing destructive conflict occurring, unilaterally or bilaterally.
And these are quite serious cases that are now in the public law. They're not private law cases. So these are councils and things like that.
Well, that's shifted quite a bit. I mean, I suppose when I first started doing these assessments, most of the cases were private law proceedings where a couple had separated, and more often than not, it would be the father who was denied contact. And he'd make an application to court. Of course, in those days, legal aid was available, which made that more achievable. And so he'd make an application to court. The mother, in the cases that came my way, would invariably make allegations of physical, emotional, or sometimes sexual abuse towards her and or the child or children. And so Kafkas would generally produce a brief report, and when persuaded, the judge would often look for an independent outside opinion as to whether the various allegations put forward by both parties had any substance, and more particularly, was there a way forward? So to go back to what I was saying just now, there's no mechanism for my reports, for example, being critically analysed. So, apart from discussions with colleagues and my proofreader and so on, in-house proofreader, and inevitably those discussions aren't, they're bound to be subject to bias, so it's very difficult to get a sense of what other people in the field are thinking about your work, because it is delivered in the context of almost complete secrecy.
Yeah, and just to give some context to that, which I've just been reminded of reading the notes from your course, when you were initially asked to do risk assessments, I don't know when this was, probably early 90s. There was a Home Office roaming brief, and you were selected to kind of deliver something, and you noticed that there was actually no precedent for risk assessments for domestic violence at that point anywhere.
Yeah, so if I roll the clock back on my career, or at least in my second incarnation anyway, as you rightly say, I was in the late 80s, early 90s. I put myself forward into the marketplace principally as a psychotherapist working with men. So that was my primary driver. I didn't know my father growing up, so some analysts would say that was what was behind my chosen career path. Really was to find ways of relating to men to compensate for the relationship I never had with my father. I think there's an element of truth in that. So that's what I set out to do, and I was hoping to establish a men's centre in Plymouth, where I was working, and got some initial funding for it, whilst also seeing men on an individual basis. And what emerged pretty quickly, really, was that the men who were being referred to me were being referred for problematic behaviour or perceived problematic behaviour. So they were very few men who sought me out as a function of any sort of internal driver. So most of the mandation was external. Most of the motivation was external. So it was a partner saying, "That's the last time, you bastard, get out and get fixed," or it would be a GP who had a male client that the GP didn't know what else to do with. I had quite a few referrals from the military, the police. So at that time, domestic violence really wasn't even on my radar as such. I mean, I knew of its existence, obviously, although it hadn't really made it onto social and political agendas at that point in any sort of significant way. So I suppose, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, I suppose I had to come to terms with with the harsh reality in those early years of, if I was going to work with men, I was going to have to work with men's violence, because almost all of the clients that I was seeing then, whatever the referral source, featured violence in their presentation. And so I was seeing young men who were being excluded from school, dropouts from the police and the army because of more violence than the military could cope with or wanted, men who'd been excluded from their homes because of what we came to call domestic violence. So it was almost sort of reluctantly, I suppose, that I thought, okay, so if I am going to forge a career in working with men, then I am going to have to think about and work out how to work with men's aggression. So, I suppose I sort of formalised my referral pathway. So what had been implicit became explicit. So I was starting then to invite referrals from men who were perceived to be violent or aggressive in one form or another. And then very quickly, I also started to notice in the profile of the men I was working with that almost all of them, if not all of them, had been violent and or abusive in their relationships with women. So these were almost all heterosexual men, some gay men, but most of them are white heterosexual men. So I started to do some reading, and at that point I thought to myself, it seemed that domestic abuse at that time was beginning to be recognised as a phenomenon that needed to be addressed. There was still very little recognition by a lot of the authorities that it was a social issue that needed to be tackled. So I started to do a lot of training with the police, both at home and abroad, and very few of the serving officers were recognised that this was police work. So police work was about catching burglars and running after, and locking up violent thugs.
It's almost gone 180 now, hasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it, so I didn't set out really to position myself in the domestic violence milieu. It just felt as though it chose me rather than the other way around.
Well, it was wide open and a nascent space, wasn't it? So fast forward. So you did all this reading and you set up this place called Ahimsa in Plymouth, which it's Indian for non-violence. Is it partly for non-violence, or it's a
Sanskrit word that Gandhi coined to describe his campaign of non-violence. Yeah.
So it's men's group work, and then you also do these risk assessment reports, and you've accumulated a lot of experience and knowledge and wisdom in this space. And like I said at the beginning, it's a really messy space for loads of different reasons. And I wonder if we could just go through some of the kind of reasons why it's a messy and confusing space. Just a kind of little bit on each thing, because it's a massive topic and we could go down a massive rabbit hole, but maybe an overview of it would be helpful.
I mean, just to finish off what you were saying there by way of background, so I set up the centre in Plymouth, which was then called the Everyman Centre, and so we were working. I was working initially, and then as the agency grew in size and we were able to attract more funding, we were the only agency in the country funded centrally by the Department of Health for several years. So we were working with male perpetrators, in inverted commas, and providing support services for their female partners. So I learnt very early on that there were risks associated with providing programs for men, because so many of the men that were referred to us used to abuse the facility. So I very quickly would bump into women in supermarkets, for example, who would say to me, "You're Kelvin Bell, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Yes." Recognize me from some, I had quite a few. I had some television slots when the agency was first being put together, and they'd say, "Well, how's my husband doing?" And I would say, "Well, we don't know you. What's your name?" And anyway, a conversation would flow from there. And then I'd find that he's never been referred, but she was nevertheless dropping him off at the end of the street on a Thursday afternoon every week, on the pretext that he'd be coming down to join the group. So those sorts of stories became very commonplace. So I started to lose some of my naivety, I think, about all we needed to do was to offer a safe place for men, and they would come in their droves and engage with sincerity, and good work would be done. Well, and of course, at the same time, this was being highly politicized by the women's movement. So it became quite contentious, really. So anyway, the work developed, and as the women's service, and we learned more about how to do the work, or how to do the work safely. And then, of course, as our reputation built locally, we started getting inquiries from family solicitors who were representing clients, fathers, who were involved in private law proceedings initially, and were looking for a risk assessment. Now, typically, what happens in a court case, as you may know, is that if a proposal is made for risk assessment, the first thing that has to happen is the judge has to be persuaded that a risk assessment is going to add value. Secondly, once the principle is established that the risk assessment might have legs, there is then effectively a legal bun fight as to who's going to be the strongest candidate to carry it out. So, of course, both sides, and I'd be by sides, I mean the mother on one side and the father on the other side, typically, both sides would put forward their preferred candidate. Now, pre-late 1990s, mid 1990s, there were no dedicated risk assessors in the domestic violence field. Violence generally was, or violence prediction work was starting to develop, but certainly there was no, there were no known risk assessors specializing in domestic abuse on this or the other side of the Atlantic, for that matter. So as I started to get inquiries, so typically what would happen at that point is psychiatry had largely had a monopoly on delivering risk assessments. So
I'm just remembering one of the things you said in the course to illustrate how just unfounded and arbitrary these were. There's one psychiatrist who wrote in a report, well, the client likes this, I discovered the client likes the same poetry as me, so my judgment is that I can't imagine that he would engage in any violent behavior.
Not the sort of man who's likely to be abusive to his wife. That's right. Exactly so. So it was all very idiosyncratic, ill-founded, poorly conceived, open to horrendous levels of bias.
Yeah.
So I came with a little bit of street cred because of the work that I'd been doing in Plymouth. So managed to get my foot in the door, and of course, what I found fairly quickly is that I was well received by the courts because I was speaking a language that most of the legal professionals could understand, and made sense to them. And more particularly, I was interested, as as fundamentally as a psychotherapist, I was interested in a solution orientation rather than just pure risk assessment, which is what you tended to get from the psychiatrist. So typically you'd get a psychiatric report which would say either this man has a deeply ingrained personality disorder, full stop, these conditions are untreatable, and essentially there's nothing to be done, or this man has no diagnosable mental health disorder, no problem here, full stop. So whatever the outcome, it was quite indigestible to the legal practitioners who were looking for solutions or recommendations about, so where do we go from here then? Where does that leave us? So I recognised, partly because that's where my interest lay and lies, is in helping people to, you know, be better parents or whatever the context is. That's where my interest lie, and that coincided with obviously what the courts were most interested in, because they wanted to move on to the next case. So didn't want a case stuck in proceedings for years and years and years, which many of them were. I mean, some of them were in proceedings then for 7-8 years at a time. You can imagine the financial and emotional costs involved. I mean, and that's without thinking about the impact on the children of just, you know, knowing that their parents are involved in proceedings for a major part of their childhood. So that's when I first started to get inquiries, and I rushed down to the library. I think this was, I mean, there was the internet obviously, but you know, to find out what was available by way of risk assessment formulations or handbooks or textbooks or whatever. And to my horror, found absolutely nothing at all. I mean, domestic violence risk assessment wasn't even mentioned in any of the literature. You were lucky if you found a textbook that mentioned domestic violence, never mind domestic violence risk assessment. So I suppose ever since then, I have been trying to develop, you know, my practice and put together a mechanism for risk assessment that is defensible. And very quickly, I moved from private law proceedings, disputed contact cases or disputed residence cases, into public law proceedings where the local authority gets involved because of conflict between the parents. So they are similar but quite different sets of proceedings, and they have and those involved, or the dynamics involved in those cases, are often very different, because if the local authority is piled in because of domestic abuse concerns, there's often an alliance between the two parents against the authorities. So the centrifugal force is for the parents to deny or minimize what's been feared or what's been established, or allegations made by the neighbours and so on. So the essence of the work initially is actually trying to work out what has happened.
Yeah.
As opposed to private law proceedings, where you tend to get exaggerated differences, which are often exaggerated by the legal process,
because of the adversarial nature of how it's set up.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we can stay with that side of things for now, because I want this interview to bring some value to parents, and probably mainly men, who are in a situation where the relationship has broke down with their ex-partner, and they've either started the court proceedings or they're thinking about it. And yeah, as we said earlier, there's a lot of there's a lot of problems with this machine, this system, if we can even call it a system. And you get red pilled when you go into it, but then it's too late. You're already in it, and the machinery the cogs are turning, and you can't just get out. So I want to kind of build a picture of what what that machine looks and feels like. Right. And you kind of mentioned already, you know, one of the things, which is it's a new area. And one of the other things is people look to psychologists maybe and psychotherapists for expertise, but in the mental health training and literature, there's hardly anything on domestic abuse and domestic violence. So it's a bit like everyone's looking around for someone who knows what they're talking about. And actually, and you know, as you told me in the training, I don't think you've never seen a risk assessment report that actually states its own methodology. So it's
well,
amazing.
despite it being a Home Office requirement. So, you know, if you've got nothing better to do and you look through the practice directions, so-called, which are lengthy documents are written for court experts. So they are prescriptive about how reports should be written, about paragraph spacings,
right?
You know, page margin sizes, etc., etc. You're reminded that as a risk assessor, it's not your task to seek to resolve disputed facts, you know, and such like. What's very explicit in there is a requirement for risk assessors to set out their methodology to risk assessment. And as you've just said, Zach, I've yet to read a report by any of my colleagues that does that.
It's extraordinary.
It is. But again, it's a reflection of the fact that there is no overarching accountability or you know, overview of what's going on. So nobody can point the finger and say something needs to happen here. So
would it be fair to call it a shit show?
I mean, maybe. I mean, I suppose it's very variable. So there are, you know, there are genuine legal practitioners involved who are trying to do the best for the children, despite the system.
Yes.
But there are, you know, I can bore you for hours with anecdotes of cases that have just been absolutely horrific.
Yeah, and I'm remembering Jane Ireland, who she runs her own risk assessment thing, but she did a report for the government in 2012, and she found that 2/3 of reports were poor or very poor, and all again, none of them had stated their methodology.
No.
And there's this question of women's rights and men's rights sort of getting in the way of the child-centric, what should be a child-centric matter, which is what's best for the child. And we don't care. Why should these other political paradigms come into it? But they often do, don't they? And domestic abuse is so politicized. And there's this element as well. I won't take too much time up on this. I'll let you talk, but I know that maybe from you that the way, once it's decided that domestic abuse is an issue in a child access case, and perhaps the father has to do some sort of work on himself, then it's likely that CAFCAS will recommend to the court that he goes on an accredited domestic abuse program, which is probably going to be one of the ones rubber stamped by an organization like Respect. Well, I think they're all done by Respect, accredited by Respect, which are they are politicized programs. They have a specific view of domestic abuse and women and men. So it's intractable at that stage. And that links to another problem, which is where is the risk? Is there more risk with men who deny it, or is there more risk with men who admit that they've been abusive? Or there's another category where they can change. But I saw in some of my notes from your training, there's a lot of confusion around what do we want men to say? Do we want them to say they're guilty or not? I mean, so it's very confusing, but those programs that men get sent on aren't very nuanced, are they? They're a sort of one size fits all solution.
It depends where you take the snapshot. I was going to say things are improving. What I could have said is things were improving because, of course, with so-called austerity and the depletion of local authority resources and charitable funding imposed by the current government, projects are dying on the vine as we speak. So if we roll the clock back, sort of 5 to 10 years, programs were flourishing. I mean, we were a long way from having one on every street corner, but most major cities in England and Wales, and also Scotland, for that matter, had an emerging men's program. Most of those have gone now, so you're right in the sense that when the first programs developed in the early 90s, they almost all of them came out of you might say, from a radical feminist perspective, and the curriculum of the program was forged accordingly. So there were programs, for example, I remember in Nottingham, where there was so little distrust in the program facilitators because they were men, that they were required to use stopwatches in the way they delivered the program. So the manuals written by the management team, and each exercise and each element of each module was timed, and they were required to set timepieces whilst they were delivering the program to show they didn't overspill. So such was the fear of collusion and and departure from the curriculum that it was controlled that heavily. In Canada, because of the belief that this was fundamentally an educational approach that was needed to address men's sexist attitudes, there was talk there. I remember reading one from the Department of Justice in Canada suggesting that there was no reason why men couldn't be herded into large halls and treated 250, 300 at a time. So that was the sort of initial mindset. Fortunately, we've moved on somewhat since then. And
there were women's groups that actually shut down men's groups, weren't there, in the UK? One of our colleagues, I remember, mentioned that.
Well, the Nottingham program I remembered was actually taken over by and shut down by a wing of the radical feminist wing.
Yeah.
I mean, that said, it was also, I mean, the first program that was the first men's program that was ever run in this country was set up by Women's Refuge. So there's always been, though in men's work, feminism still in many ways gets a bad press. I mean, it's not a unified body of activity or thought or ideology. So I worked in Plymouth Refuge for a year or so, which was an experience I wouldn't particularly want to repeat, but I'm glad I had the opportunity of doing it. And the woman that ran the refuge there, in many ways, I think was quite a visionary, because she recognized that almost all of the women, heterosexual women living in the refuge, were either going to go back to their partners or go back to other partners who are likely to have similar characteristics. So she thought there was absolutely no point in trying to educate those women in having nothing to do with men. So in contrast to almost all of the other refuges in the southwest, or the country for that matter, she used to, I mean, it was done very cautiously, but she used to invite men in selectively into the refuge to demonstrate to the women in the refuge that there were men who were respectful of women, and that the sorts of men that they come across weren't necessarily the sort of men that they would have to choose and associate with when they left the refuge. So, but yes, so programs. So there was a fear that, and I think well placed, because I think there was a lot of work done by male therapists who held, I think, a far too liberal position about believing that they just needed to provide a safe psychological space for men, and men would thereby self-actualize, and somehow through some sort of osmotic process would learn to be,
and
decent fathers and partners.
Yeah, and this isn't borne out by the data, is it? So it's the dichotomy, the variable risks and the static risks, and what you've just mentioned is an example of a variable risk factor. So is the client, is the male client showing a different perspective and maybe more ability to show empathy? And he may be, but actually if on his file it says that he's been convicted of violent assault or something, and he's unemployed, and I don't know, I can't remember what the other factors might be, but things like that just they're just in his history and they won't ever change. That tends to be a more accurate predictor of what he's going to do in the future than various.
Yes, factors. Absolutely. If you had to choose between examining an individual's case files and a face-to-face interview with no collateral information about that individual, choose the case file every time.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say men, but human beings have a remarkable capacity to lie to themselves and to others, very convincingly. And I look back now with horror at some of the naive work I did with men in the early years of my career, and feel very awkward about some of the work that I did then, because that was my overarching belief that all I needed to do was to build a relationship with a bloke, and something good could come out of that. But
I'm remembering your story of you felt like you were getting somewhere with this guy, and then you got a call from his partner, and she had been attacked with a Coke bottle.
Yeah, I can remember that when she was in a telephone box over Torbay Way, and I'd been working with this guy for, I can't remember now, 3 or 4 months, and convinced that we were doing good work together. And yeah, she rang me from a telephone box and said, with blood running down her face and saying, he's hit me over the head with a Coke bottle, what should I do? And after you've had half a dozen or so of those experiences, you quickly lose a lot of naivety and go into the work with a degree of skepticism and caution, in recognition of the fact that what's going on between the two of you in the consulting room is only a tiny piece of the wider social context.
And it's what happens in the world that matters, not what happens in the therapy room.
Yeah.
And there's this idea in the literature around this that there's dangerous situations, not dangerous persons. I think that's a famous quote from one of the books quite a while ago. So it's, what are the risk factors? What are the and one of the risk factors is the end of a relationship, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we look at the risk situations, or the high risk situations for serious physical injury anyway, so we're looking at body counts, if you like, because at its simplest, they're the easiest to count. I mean, it's a lot easier to count a dead body than it is somebody who's got an enduring psychological injury.
Yeah, and this is a very low base rate, isn't it? What is the base rate for that?
Well, the numbers are tiny. So I mean, if we're talking, I suppose about 2 women a week killed by their male partners in the UK at the moment. But of those, about the figures vary depending on when the research is done. But of those, about 75% or so of those deaths will have occurred in the run-up to or immediately afterwards the separation.
Yeah, and the what kind of are the numbers the other way around? What's the female or male level of body count?
In the UK, I mean, it's negligible.
Okay.
It's very different in the States because, of course, almost everybody walks around with a gun.
What is it, out of interest? Is it parity? Because there's
no,
parity
it's far higher. Oh, what you mean between the sexes?
Yeah, between the sexes in the States.
It's closer, for that reason. And so I remember a quote from an article written by a feminist colleague some years back, and she said it was one of the ironies of the successes of the battered women's movement, as it was called in the States, is that the first improvement in fatalities were with men. So as the movement started to provide safe accommodation for women had alternatives to escape a relationship other than blowing the bloke's head off with a weapon.
Yeah, because you said at one point that there's 200 reports showing that there's parity in violence in terms of men on women and women on men. So if we're taking out the actual lethality, the killing, murdering, it's more or less equal. Is that right?
To be honest, Zach, I still think, despite decades now of empirical research and people who've devoted their entire lives to researching this issue, I don't think we know.
Okay.
I think it's so hard to get a representative sample, particularly in increasingly multicultural countries, because there are huge cultural variations within that. It's really, really hard to know, and I think one of the difficulties with the whole field is that we live in a world and surrounded by media that has a very binary way of looking at things. So men are either risky or they're not, or women are either victims or they're not. And one of the things that we have to tussle with in the domestic abuse milieu is complexity. And so if you go and interview women who are resident at a women's refuge, for example, you'll get a very different perspective from both the workers and the residents than you would if, for example, you went to a community psychology centre or a family therapy centre, who are working with troubled couples. So what we found, and this is supported in a lot of US research, we don't have the resources or the will to undertake wide-scale research in the UK. So almost all of what we know has come from North America, the United States and Canada. Is what we see is a very different context depending upon where you do your research. So what is clear is that most domestic abuse results in non-lethality. So the cases in which somebody ends up getting killed, and that's almost always the woman in this country, are not necessarily representative, and in fact are unlikely to be representative of the wider cases at large.
So we end up with this, in your words, how did you put it? A trawler of false positives for men.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So one of the difficulties with that is that, understandably, because of the potential risks to the woman in this case and the children involved by extension of those high risk cases, almost everybody is risk averse. And for people who are ill-trained, and that's most people when it comes to domestic abuse, including professionals doing risk assessments, even if you look at senior social workers doing risk assessments now, their training on domestic abuse was tiny, and their training on domestic violence risk assessment was zero. So even amongst the people who are charged to deliver this work, they are poorly trained. Right? So which is going back to what I was trying to do on the training course. So what we need to tussle with is this issue of typologies.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So not every domestic violence case is the same. And the problem is because not a lot of professionals understand that, they approach it from a one-size-fits-all mentality, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
And so solutions and pathways and recommendations flow from that. But if your fundamental premise of this is a brutish, coercively controlling man and a hapless female partner who can't escape for fear of her life, then you're going to make flawed recommendations if that's not the profile of the couple you're working with.
Yeah. And there's a muddling of risk identification versus risk assessment. And in your training, you showed us these different axes. There's one is sensitivity versus specificity, and one is probability versus severity. And there's the dash is it's a kind of,
it's a checklist.
It's a checklist for
the back of fact pack. I mean, I don't mean to be derogatory about it, but essentially it's a back of fact packet assessment for busy professionals who don't have training and time to do.
So it's used by CAFCAS and these other agencies, is it?
Police officers, a lot of agencies throughout the country. Yeah.
Okay, and it says identify. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, go on.
It says identifiable indicators of risk of serious harm. That's its definition of high risk, but that isn't actually an assessment of risk. It's just a risk identification.
Yeah.
So the definitions are really important here, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
Yeah.
And the difficulty when it comes to going back to your context, when it comes to contested proceedings, of course, if we look at the dash, as you will have seen from those 21 questions, however many they are now, they rely almost entirely on the woman's account.
Yeah. Are you frightened? Do you think he can kill? Was one of the questions, do you think he could kill you or something?
Do you think he's capable of killing you? Yes. I haven't looked at the dash for a long time, actually.
I saw it. I can't find it in my notes, but yeah, I mean, yeah.
So if you have a woman who's genuinely in fear of her life, what we know from research is in such cases, the best risk assessor is indeed the woman herself. She knows this bloke, she's seen the look in his eyes, she sees the cycles. I've got images in my head of having over the table conversations with women who would say, I knew when I was going to get a beating. And sometimes the agony of knowing, wondering whether it was going to be tomorrow or the day after that, I would do something to provoke him to get the beating over and done with and take charge of the timescales. And then I knew I would probably have 3 or 4 weeks before I'd get another severe beating.
And probably have, more, he'd be generous and great sex.
Yeah, knowing that there's a honeymoon afterwards. Quite. So going back to the dash, so for women who are trapped in, and many of them are trapped in that sort of coercively controlling dynamic where you've got a tyrant for a father and partner, the dash is great because it does readily identify which of those is likely to be high risk. But if you transpose that into contested legal proceedings, sometime after the couple have separated, and then you start using the dash as your risk assessment tool, which many professionals do, it's completely untenable, because we know that, like blokes, women are perfectly capable of lying through their teeth. We know that a number of them go to court and will obstruct contact for reasons that have got absolutely nothing to do with domestic abuse. You know, the mother has got off with a new bloke, she wants to sever contacts with the last bloke, or she's being made to by the new bloke. So there are a whole host of reasons why women obstruct contact for less than genuine reasons. So of course the dash at that point becomes a convenient tool for her and her legal representatives, because she can simply put yes on all those questions and then is seen as a highly vulnerable, high-risk victim.
And it flies.
Yeah.
Because barristers and judges aren't, like everyone else in this space, don't know what's what.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So there's no, so to do a thorough risk assessment, there is no substitute for a painstaking examination of the history. That's not always possible, because often there is no recorded history. So you've got he says, she says. Exhaustive interviews to look at the individual's previous histories. So from my point of view, obviously looking at a man and a woman's previous relationship history is an essential part of risk assessment formulation. So I can remember interviewing a bloke in prison some years ago now, and said to him, how many sexual relationships have you had with women? I can't remember the exact figure, but he said something like 1,024, still counting. And you might put that down to bravado on his part, but I think he was probably fairly genuine. And when I said, what's the longest intimate relationship you've had, he said, probably a weekend. So just in that,
yeah,
it just tells you a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Before you even look at anything else, you just know you're dealing with a man who's got a very troubled history and is incapable of sustaining a relationship for more than about 72 hours.
Yeah. So in the cases, and probably most of the cases, are you all right for time? We've gone past.
I've got an appointment at 2:30, so as long as I'm clear.
We'll just finish it. I just wanted to say there's this, in most cases, is it true to say in most cases these types of in-depth reports aren't happening? So in a private law case, say, the judges will just be getting all the he says, she says things, and the judges tend to think that they can tell truth from lies. And on top of that, there's this other thing, which is the well-being of the child is often subsumed beneath the welfare of the mother. So all this talk about has the father been abusive to the mother, kind of it can kind of take up all the oxygen of the proceedings, when actually the proceedings are supposed to be most of the time about child access. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in as a
I think and that situation is, for the time being at least, getting worse, because the current administration have done all they can to exclude experts from the legal arena.
So it's social workers.
Rates.
Yeah.
So social workers are now the new experts, despite, again, no improvement in training budgets or anything like that. CAFCAS, and there are some exceptionally good CAFCAS officers out there.
Right.
They don't have the time to even do interviews now in private law cases. So interviews with children are often done by telephone. The interviews with the parents concerned are quite often quite cursory. I saw a letter only the other day from Kafka saying we simply don't have time to attend these proceedings because we're so overwhelmed with work.
And that's not their fault.
No,
that's just their
that's right.
caseload. And many social workers are part-time, aren't they? So they get given a case and then they just pass it to someone else. So it kind of that might suit them in terms of not having to take on the whole responsibility for it. And there is an element of arse covering that goes on, understandably, in that system, because it's when you've got a caseload that's almost unmanageable, you know, you must know on some level that something's going to go wrong at some point. So,
well, in child protection work, it's not unusual at all for social workers to be carrying a caseload of 75 or more cases.
wow.
So these are live domestic violence cases. I mean, it's just completely unmanageable. And in the old days, whenever they were, social workers had the time and resources to be able to develop relationships with families. So there was always a degree of hesitation about families building relationships with social workers. But social workers used to drop by enough cups of tea and build relationships. And many of the older ones knew that if you were going to do any meaningful work with a family in order to try and enhance the lives of the children involved, you needed to build a relationship with the parents. So whenever they were passing the door, they'd knock on the door. Sometimes they'd be greeted, they'd be welcomed, you know, not certainly with open arms, but warmly. And other times they'd be told to fuck off. These days, that doesn't happen. Child protection social workers are evidence gatherers. They rarely have any chance to build any relationship with parents because they parachute in to collect evidence. They then spend the next 4 days writing reports. The system at the moment is on its knees.
Thank you, Calvin.
Welcome.
It's kind of bleak, but it's good to get the on the ground reality.
Well, we're at the foothills of something, aren't we? And you know, if you roll the clock back through history, I mean, if you look at child sexual abuse, for example, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, I mean, we didn't even have a name for it, really. You know, Jimmy Savile was out there doing his thing, with impunity. We didn't even have any vocabulary, really, to describe what was going on in children's homes and what was going on in our own homes. And then it got named and recognised and researched, and now we have an extensive body of knowledge around it. Still lots of contentious areas, but it's and it's far less politicized than domestic violence.
Right. It takes time. I guess the people have to die, don't they? For the next, it's like in academia, ideas take time to get taken over by new ideas, but the people in tenure have to die.
Well, it's political, isn't it? Because I think it's about what we value most. If you lived in a world, and we could go over to Scandinavia, for example, if you live in a world where there is more than lip service to the value we place on children, then the sorts of things we're talking about would be high order priority.
Yeah.
So disputed contact proceedings, for example, would be fully funded. In the interests of the child, not in the interests of the parents. You do everything, as they do in many continental countries, you do everything to avoid disputed legal proceedings because everyone knows that it is just a money bucket for legal practitioners. And although there are plenty of very devoted legal practitioners involved, the system is not conducive to resolving these sorts of difficulties with the welfare of children in mind. So if we really valued children in our society, you'd see a radically different approach to the whole field, including domestic abuse being recognised as a legitimate sphere of study in its own right, and funding being made available within research institutions, universities, and so on, to improve and take forward our understanding. But we are under the current regime, we are at risk of domestic violence going back into the ghetto that it was in 30 years ago.
And I remember you saying you, in your PhD, you wanted to write about it, and Birmingham University said
two specialists.
Yeah. Listen, I don't want to keep you for any longer.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your generosity.
You're very welcome.
Is there anything you want to say to viewers about your organisation in case they want to look you up? Have you got a website or contact?
Don't ring me, I'll ring you, because I can't cope with the workload, Zach. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, take care. Anyway, it's really good to see you.
Yeah, good luck to you, and you.
Thank
Talk
you.
again soon, hopefully.
Yeah, cheers.
Ta-ra. Bye.